Hello and welcome everyone around the world for another exclusive presentation right here on Your Contact. For the very best in UFO Paranormal Talk Radio on the World Wide Web, you're locked into KGRAradio.com. It is time, as we do every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, to bring you Grant Cameron and the Cameron Files. And now, your host, Grant Cameron.
Good evening. This is Grant Cameron. You're listening to the Cameron Files. It's January the 1st, 2019. We have made another trip around the shining sun, and we're still working on the UFO mystery. Tonight, I am joined by a friend and one of the superstars of the UFO world, Linda Moulton Howe. Highlights of her bio include she's a graduate of Stanford University with a master's degree in communications. She has won numerous, and I do mean numerous, awards in the UFO community. And outside the UFO community, she's got 3 regional Emmys, a national Emmy nomination, and a Peabody Award. She's written 4 books on the subject of UFOs. She runs the website earthfiles.com, reporting on science, medicine, and the environment, and UFOs. She co-hosts a radio show with John Burroughs called Phenomena Radio, here on KGRA, Thursday evenings, and I have been lucky enough to be a guest a number of times on the show. I have known Linda since the 1980s, when we discussed in the early days the stories of MJ-12, Bill Moore, Robert Emenegger, Richard Doty, cattle mutilations, and a whole host of mysteries that still haunt the UFO community. So I think this is Linda's anniversary, like 40 years she's been in this. I've been in this a little bit longer. We spent a lot of time together talking about this. We've been good friends all along. Welcome, Linda Howe, to my show, and thank you for taking time to talk to me.
Hey, Grant, thank you for having me here. And as you were just speaking, my mind was flooded with some of the conference discussions that we've had, the times we sat with Robert Emenegger trying to ferret out what was truth and what was perhaps deflection, and that would be the story of the last 40 years. You and I and a few others, we have really cared about whether or not we could get to facts and truth. And we have been running through a landscape of razor blades and efforts to slow us down, make us fall, and get off of the path, because it's so strange as we move into 2019 that our government and other governments of this planet would still want to perpetuate the strange concocted mythology that we're alone in the universe, as if that knowledge would somehow threaten the world as we are moving into the middle of the 21st century. Grant, why do you think that is still going on in a perpetual policy?
Well, my personal impression is always comes down to the old idea that it gets down to military technology. I was just doing some research last night on this whole thing of the experiencer program and the role of Kit Green, and ran across the idea that he had worked for the Tiger Committee, this committee that looks at advances for the next 20 years on mental stuff, on drugs, all this kind of stuff. It always comes down to that with me. Who do you think in the government, when we talk about government cover-up, who do you think is actually the people that are covering it up? And number 2, who do you think is actually the people who have made these sort of disclosures, like the AATIP disclosure, and you hear, we can maybe get into the rumors of new stuff that they're about to drop on the UFO community. So who do you think is covering it up? Because the government's a big place, and who do you think may be behind trying to give us a little bit of a hint as to what's going on?
You know Diana Pasulka and her new book having to do? Okay. When I did an interview with her with John on Phenomenon, one of the sentences that stuck out, she said that the person who took her down to Roswell, that blindfolded her for the trip to a site allegedly where our government, the Department of Defense as the big box, had retrieved physical evidence, was a man who is currently in the Pentagon. And she told me that she promised that she would never, ever utter his name under any circumstances. But the sentence that I've never forgotten is she said, he is extremely high in the Pentagon. And as far as I know, he is the one controlling policy on all things related to UFOs and ETs. And then John Burroughs tried to ask, which is a question he's had all along, when To the Stars a year ago on December 17th, that's only 1 year ago from almost in a couple of weeks from January 1st. And that was that big headline in the above the fold in the New York Times about the FLIR infrared. And as John's life unfolded with people coming from various walks of professional life to John to do some work with To the Stars about Rendlesham, John called me one day and said, you know, I am really convinced that, let's say, Louis Elizondo and the group, they cannot be the ones that are the policymakers.
Right.
They have to be reporting to somebody else, which is exactly why Diana Pasulka's statement about the man who was in control of her blindfolded trip.
Yeah.
That was only, 5 years ago, I believe. So now all of us would like to know who is truly in charge. But the other side of what I'm addressing on the first day of January 2019, which I personally feel, Grant, that this is going to be a tumultuous year. I think it's going to be tumultuous in the weather. I think it's going to be tumultuous in more seismic and volcanic activity. That's what geophysicists are expecting. And that simultaneously, as the Earth is agitated, we know that there have been announcements like March 2019. What new revelations might come from To the Stars that is related exactly to your question? Who is really in charge of the flow of information, the blocking of information, the counterintelligence misinformation flow? And has there been an absolutely high Pentagon decision now that they have to, there's not any more question like World War II, that if they don't start getting out facts and truth as they want taxpayer money to fund them going to Mars, fund them going to Alpha Centauri, funding a space force, Congress having secret meetings, how would we ever go forward any longer, even pretending that the United States is a democracy, if there is not some effort now in an entire world public way to start getting out facts and truth that would support the reason why we need a space force?
Yeah. When you talk about this fellow that did the blindfolding, I think I know who he is. I've actually had a discussion with him, and he told me a couple of things, just a couple of minor things about he's an experiencer, his own sort of how he sort of got dragged into this thing. You've been, and I've heard that he has been briefing people on this, like researchers, not that, like, for example, taking Diana to New Mexico to show her this. You're sort of stepping across the line of secrecy and doing this. And John talks about, being given this briefing by Lou Elizondo, and you've had a lot of people who have come to you over the years, telling you stories, giving you little bits. What do you think is going on there?
Why the whistleblowers?
Yeah, because if you look at it, that's actually like a felony. If you look at the law, I think it's 18 USC 798, 10 years in jail for violating security oaths. So what's going on? Why are these people walking out and talking about it? And because the more I hear especially the last couple of months, I hear about these stories where people are actually being brought in and being told what's going on. And that doesn't make any sense. So how do you explain the whistleblowers over the years?
Probably in many cases sanctioned.
Yeah.
The approach to me, though, has varied. In the most recent 10 years, people have come to me at conferences. Conferences are a great camouflage, where the dramatic one 2.5 years ago when I was at Eureka Springs, and I had just done a presentation, and I was surrounded by maybe 40, 50 people. I mean, it was a big crowd around me, and I'm stressing that. Not that it is unique. Conferences involve that, where you finish and everybody wants to ask you questions, but it was an especially large crowd. And what I remember so distinctly was a person that I had never met physically in the world, but had communicated some amazing information about Antarctica by mail and by other ways. And so I had a name, and I had a DD-214. I had other certificates, but I had never met this individual. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? The approach had been through hard mail and documents to establish credibility. So when a crew cut head that looked military from everybody else, there was nobody else there with a very fine razored, half-inch crew cut. When he leaned forward amidst, and I'm talking, and anybody who has been around me in conferences know I'm always talking with a lot of people, and that was the whole energy when this person leaned out toward me and just simply said, "I'm," and it was the name. And that, and of course, I can't react. I can't do anything. I have to keep in the energy. This person understands that. It's a great cover. Nobody knows anything, right? Mm-hmm. And then all I did was say, just wait in the back. And when the room was completely empty, we were able to immediately go to a vehicle and go to a place where there would be nobody from the conference, and that we could talk for 7 hours, which we did. Yeah. And so that's variations on that have occurred several times. Back in the 1979, September is when I began the investigation for the CBS station in Denver about the animal mutilations, which were in a huge upsurge again in the fall of 79. And I had no idea. I truly have had a life of a lot of education with a lot of curiosity and interest about astronomy and physics and all things science. And I love the Earth, and therefore I'm very concerned about the environmental trashing of the Earth, and have been ever since I got out of Stanford, and there were issues then about pollution and control. So I've had these several tracks in my life. I graduated from Stanford in '68, and I was a producer in TV stations, KNBC in Los Angeles, WCVB in Boston, and was married then. And it was my husband's moves that took me from where we graduated at Stanford, and then we were married and went to Los Angeles, and we were both working as producers. And then in Boston, I did medicine and science for 2 years there. And then in Denver, I was hired to be director of special projects at the CBS station. My job was to do documentaries, live studio programs with live audiences, and news segments, approximately 3 to 4 in-depth, either as live studio and or film documentaries a year while I was there at the station for about 6-7 years. And when I got to the fall of 79, it was the headlines that other media were reporting about animal mutilations that made me want to get to the bottom of what I thought could be government manipulation of something they were doing that was toxic in the environment. That was exactly my first hypothesis. But as soon as I started doing my first, what's called preview interviews, where you're not taking an expensive crew with you, you are going out and doing pre-interviews. And the first one was Sheriff Tex Graves up in Sterling, Colorado. And that day was like I went through Alice in Wonderland's mirror, psychologically, emotionally, physically, in every way, compared to all of my life before September of 79. And the reason was I am with a sheriff who had worked for 23 years, a huge man, a John Wayne type of man, few words that counted, a large frame, and he gets 266 color Polaroids that he took himself, chain of custody on those images, which have always meant chain of custody to me has always meant everything. Because when I was at Stanford University and I did a huge project for the Stanford Medical Center, and I did my master's thesis on using computers for the very first time at the Stanford Linear Accelerator to analyze bombardment. And it was drilled into me that I had to be able to prove, to have a timeline, to know when was I filming X, why? Because these were science and medical to be used for public and conference ways, and they had to be absolutely accurate. And I stress this because chain of custody has meant everything to me in all of my work. And here I am with a sheriff in Sterling, Colorado, who pulls out 266 color Polaroids, and he took the photos. He is talking to me firsthand. And when he said, "Linda, I'll save you some time. The perpetrators of these bloodless, trackless animal mutilations are creatures from outer space." Okay. And I can still remember the physical reaction of my body. It was as if I were touching my father's garden electrical wire that he kept to keep animals out of his garden. And my brother and I would play with touching that electric fence just for, just for the hell of it. And It was exactly, I still can remember that when the sheriff said that, it was like I was touched with the electric fence. And that marker in time and what unfolded from September of 79 to today, January 1st, 2019, talking with you, was in many ways lifting off of me my innocence. I came into all of this with such a pure desire only to know what the truth and the facts were. And then finding that after I had reported about animal mutilations and that I was monitored and photographed the entire time secretly, and that I came to understand that the clicks in my home phone and my office phone, while I was doing a strange harvest about the animal mutilations that the sheriff said the perpetrators were creatures from outer space, that I had, because I was a manager in the TV station, in the CBS station, I was a manager of a department. I could call the AT&T office in Denver and say who I was, and I wanted to confirm if the clicks on my home phone and my office phone were a tap. And to have a confirmation in the spring of 1980, my broadcast was May 25th, 1980. I was concerned about phone tap sounds somewhere earlier, like February, March. And I made this communication, and I was told officially, I still remember that vividly, "Linda, there is an official tap on your home and office phones." And when I said, "By whom?" they said, "We cannot give you that information, but we can confirm your phones are tapped." That was another layer in what you and I and others who had no other agenda except to find out what the truth is about what alien presence interacts with our planet Earth, with our moon. I'm convinced Mars has ancient archaeology now from current whistleblowers? And why would the government of the United States, with its World War II allies, have firm policies of denial to the point that they have killed people in order to keep this secret? And therefore, as I kept walking through to finally getting the broadcast, it was as if not just Alice in Wonderland's mirror, it was something that still bothers me right now today, that people are threatened, and I am probably 24/7, 365 monitored for what? I want to just simply understand, who are we humans? Who made us? Because I think that the document that Richard Doty showed me at Kirtland Air Force Base, which is now only about 20 miles from where I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but this is April 9th, 1983, after I had done A Strange Harvest, after that film got a regional Emmy, after I was approached by Home Box Office to do a documentary for them. And they even had a title when they approached me: we would like you to do an hour documentary from Home Box Office called UFOs, the ET Factor. And I was working on a script, and I was excited that I was going to be able to go to national and world communication through Home Box Office on what I knew were truths that were being denied at every level, from sheriff's offices to the FBI to the Air Force, that this was going to be a breakthrough. And finally, we would be told that we're not alone in the universe. That was another layer of innocence, because as soon as it was clear that I had a signed and dated contract with Home Box Office, and that I was working with Gersten, the attorney who, Peter Gersten, who had helped the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy file FOIA after FOIA was not a law in the United States until the last half of the 1970s. And Peter Gersten filed the first FOIA against all of the intelligence agencies, military agencies, on behalf of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. And on the day, it was spring equinox, and it was March 21st, 1983. I've never forgotten it. That's when I was in New York City to sign and date my contract with Home Box Office at the Home Box Office headquarters. And Peter Gersten and others knew I was in New York, and he and Patrick Quage had asked me to go to dinner. And at dinner is when Peter Gersten pulled up a lawyer's, those rectangular briefcases that have hard corners, because they hold more and it's safer. And he opened it up, and inside, I remember that it was not all what you would consider to be black and white 8.5 by 11 stationery. Some of the letters that he was describing were on blue stationery, handwritten. And he said they were from a man who worked for the Air Force Office of Special Investigations in Albuquerque, New Mexico, named Richard C. Doty. And he had typed and he had handwritten. And this is Gersten, who, remember, in January of 1980, 3 years before, there were headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post and around the world about this attorney, Peter Gersten, who had successfully taken the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy case all the way to the Supreme Court. People forget this. And it was that effort by the same Peter Gersten who is showing me these letters in his briefcase in New York City in 1983. It is the same Gersten who had the headlines 3 years earlier in 1980 about getting what? Getting in camera, out of the public, all of these documents that were completely blacked out. That's when they used black, Later on, they cleaned up the optics a little better by whiting out. It doesn't look quite as dramatic as blackout. And here were all of these pages blacked out over what? It was Gersten had filed FOIA for any and all information about UFOs, and I think he added something about alien intelligence from the CIA, NSA, DIA, NR, all of them, and military, and Wright-Patterson, and on and on. And it went to in camera because everybody that he was filing those Freedom of Information Act requests about nothing more than documents on all these UFOs and ETs that were being reported around the world. In camera, the judge is being told by all of these agency officials, this is coming directly from Peter Gersten to me, that this all affects national security. And you and I now know in January 1st, 2019, that national security threat has been the big box that the Department of Defense and all the intel agencies have used since the CIA came into existence September 18th, 1947. And ever since, in the interest of national security, has been the big box that everything has gone in to keep everything about UFOs and an alien presence away from human public.
Yeah.
And that is then Gersten was the first to reveal that, and that I'm sitting with him in New York after signing that contract, and he is pulling out all these documents and these letters and says, this is an AFOSI agent at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. He said, you want to do this documentary for home box office. We want to follow up what this agent in all these letters in this briefcase are talking about, a face-to-face encounter at Ellsworth Air Force Base in 1978, in which a security guard pulled a gun on some kind of, not a gray, as I understood it then, it was a blonde in a jumpsuit that comes out of a silver disc that had set down at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota.
Okay.
And the security guard pulled a gun, aimed it at this being. The being anticipated, and I believe it was green or red, like a laser, but who knows what the energy was, came right at the security guard's hand, and the gun evaporated, leaving nothing but superficial scorches on the security guard's hand. And I remember Peter Gersten saying, our government would sure like that technology.
Exactly.
And Linda, I'll set up, this is Peter Gersten, I'll set up a meeting between you and Richard Doty at Kirtland. I'll get the date, I'll get the time. You go there, you ask him, because he said he will provide witness names and phone numbers who saw this security guard aim the gun and saw the laser light take the gun out of his hand, and that this is really an amazing UFO situation. And we want to go to South Dakota for Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, and you can follow us, and it will be win-win all the way around. Great. This would be fantastic.
Yeah.
So that was March 21st in New York. Peter Gersten called me 2 or 3 times, and the meeting was set up for April 9th, 1983 at Kirtland Air Force Base. I thought that I would be going in to get a list of witness names and phone numbers in Ellsworth Air Force Base. And that is when we go, I have to be escorted in a car from outside of Kirtland I am now driving with this Richard Doty, who just waves through these various security gates. We come to the AFOSI office, and I remember the first thing I thought, wow, this is at the heart of intel, another naivete at this base, and the paint is peeling. It looks like nothing has been upkept on it since World War II. Wow. And we go up these steps where the paint is peeling, but the door, you don't open that door. You have to know how to punch it, do punch locks.
Yeah.
And so suddenly you go from something that looks like it's trying to hide under dilapidation, and yet it has these modern glass doors with locks, and you go through not only one, you went in through another, and then you're into a world with people, and there were more punch locks, and we had to go down a hall, and then we went into this big office that had a huge desk, and it wasn't Richard Doty, and he said, my boss, I remember that, my boss told me to use his office. 10 more years later, as my levels of innocence kept being stripped away, a man approached me at a conference and said, I want you to know that on April 9th, 1983, at Kirtland Air Force Base at the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, you were wearing a blouse that had a dark background and it had white polka dots, and you were wearing and kept describing me. And my mind was racing back to being at Kirtland, where Richard Doty told me to sit after I had sat down where a normal person would sit in front of a desk. He said, quote, because I've never forgotten this, I have sort of a, what do you call it, a flypaper mind for audio. Things I don't forget. He reached with his left arm into the desk, pulled open a drawer, pulled out a 11 by 14 type or 8 by 10. I don't remember if it was 11 by 14 or 8 by 10, but it was a manila envelope. And as he is doing this, his hand went into the envelope and he starts pulling out white pages as he says, quote, my superiors have asked me to show this to you. You can read these pages. You cannot take notes. And I want you to move from the chair you are in to that chair. Well, in the middle of this huge office was a green leather chair. It was right in the sort of like in the middle of the floor. Nobody ever would just come in and sit there. But I was so green then, it didn't occur to me that I was being directed to be videotaped, audio taped, photographed, while I read the pages for reaction of what he was handing me.
Yeah.
I do remember that as I stood up, confused about what was happening, because I thought I was only going to get names and addresses, but I'm a very curious mind and I want to know what is in these pages. So he's handing them to me and I am moving confused toward this green leather large chair in the middle of the room that isn't connected to anything. And I'm looking at the top and it's all caps. Everything was all caps. Briefing paper for the President of the United States of America on the subject of unidentified aerial vehicles. The paper also used the acronym unidentified aerial craft. So UAVs and UACs were mixed in this paper. There was no date. I always look for dates first on anything. There was no date. It did not name the president. But as I sat down, not knowing I was videotaped and audio taped and watched and monitored, I think there was a one-way mirror in that room as well. I remember I was reading about, in the beginning, the Mantell crash.
Yeah.
I was reading about the various Project Signs, the stuff that we've heard about from history books going back to the end of World War II. And then, after about 2 or 3 pages of this history, of which, when you look, this is the first time I think I'm thinking this, that until then, animal mutilations were confusing because they were negative to me. They were horrible, but they were not messy. And therefore, I could travel, I could go to animal mutilations, I could do investigations, I could take scalpels, I could take scissors, I could be harvesting from these same animals, thinking that the sheriff said extraterrestrials were doing this. And I could carry formalin and cut out tissue to get to a pathologist, all of this of which I was doing. And I didn't feel fear when I was doing that, partly because it was so clean, it was so neat, it was so precise. And the sheriff was saying that it was creatures from outer space. And they weren't hurting humans, I was told, only the animals. And somewhere in my mind, in my soul as a human on Earth, I was more curious about why something from outer space would be gathering all of this tissue and fluids from these animals, but they weren't hurting us, I did not think. But as I read those first 3 pages at Kirtland on April 9th, 1983, I remember thinking the Mantell crash is featured here. And that is where a pilot in a plane coming out of an Air Force base in Kentucky is trying to identify something that he radioed back was 300 feet in diameter and was silver, and that he was approaching it. And then there was some horrific event because they found his plane over a mile of crash debris. They found his body, and as I recall, Grant, tell me if I'm not remembering correctly, there were 1 to 2 millimeter holes, like craters, all over the surface of all of the metal. And that I have been told in just recent years, they found similar holes on the pilot's body, Mantell.
I don't remember that, no.
Well, I'm pretty sure that's true, and I know it is on the metal, but the thing was that it's being described as such in this document for the president, and it leaves immediately, well, this doesn't sound friendly, this sounds hostile. So when it got to a paragraph on around page 3 that said, these extraterrestrial biological entities manipulated DNA in already evolving primates to create Homo sapien, and the Latin word is there, capital HOMO space SAPIENS. And the next sentences were about the alien presence, the Ebens, the extraterrestrials, creating and doing this manipulation. And then there was a paragraph that began 2,000 years ago. A being was sent to this planet in order to teach Homo sapien, the Latin word was there again, to teach Homo sapien about love and nonviolence. And then there were 2 more sentences, and they had to do with that this being came with 2 or 3 others. And the last sentence was, and human Homo sapien killed all three. That was the way the sentence was in the document. And the last page, it was the next to the last page. The very last page was about Project Aquarius, defined as the investigations of the CIA and the National Security Agency and other agencies to investigate, monitor, and analyze all things related to the presence of extraterrestrial biological entities. And all of that was being put in binders that were called the Yellow Book and this book and that book. Mm-hmm. But the page before that, that's the last. The page before that was a list of projects. And the very top one was Project Garnet, all cap Garnet. All questions and mysteries about the evolution of Homo sapien on this planet have been answered, and this project is closed. And I remember by the time I got to that, my brain said, remember your birthday. I was born January 20th, and I'm an Aquarius, and the stone for Aquarius is garnet. So okay. I made a mental note to myself, remember your birthday stone. And I remember reading almost more than the other paragraph, because this was written so definitively. All questions and mysteries about the evolution of Homo sapien on this planet have been answered, and this project is closed, followed by the end, Project Aquarius, about all things extraterrestrial, being monitored by everybody, being put in binders, books, so. Wow. Also, that's important is that at that meeting, this man that Gersten had contacted, and it's coming into my mind now as sometimes you remember things even more deeply as you talk about them. When we came into that big office, before he gave me the briefing paper and we're walking to that big desk, he said to me, you know, you broadsided the United States government with that documentary of yours. And it was almost said with sarcasm. And I remember thinking, I broadsided the US government with animal mutilations? What is the truth? How wide, how deep are the layers? What is the connection between the mutilation of animals all around this planet going back to at least the early 1960s and probably for thousands of years disguised as animal sacrifices in other civilizations? What would an alien advanced intelligence do with all of the genetic material coming from an ear, eye, jaw flesh, tongue, genitals, rectum, tail hair? What? Why? And of course, I went to geneticists with all of those lists. Ask if you were going to be doing genetic studies, why would you take the tissue from here? No one ever seeing any reason for it, because the geneticists, when I was doing this work in the 79 to the 80s, they would say that they would want pancreas cells because they were the largest to work with in terms of studies of chromosomes. And eventually, as the 80s unfolded into the 90s, and it was the people in the human abduction syndrome that were coming to me in increasing numbers. And it was the people in the human abduction syndrome who said, Linda, they want sperm. They want eggs. They're making hybrids. They're making androids. The little 3-foot grays, they are like having a vacuum cleaner. They make these vacuum cleaner little androids to do work on this planet, in this atmosphere, in this gravity, to do whether they go through walls into a house, whether they stop a car with a beam, whether they are picking up animals from pastures, mutilating in a craft and putting the animals back down. Many ranchers saw animals rising in beams of light, being lowered, but they would never stand in front of a camera and say that because they are so afraid of being criticized or being said they were nuts. When it isn't just the United States, there are people in Brazil, there are people in Argentina, in Mexico, in many parts of the planet who have seen beams lift up animals and lower them. So the circumstantial evidence, and then you add the human abduction layer as real human beings having bizarre interfaces with an alien presence, in which in a few cases, they feel that they are dealing with something that has compassion and is doing something to help them. The vast majority of people in the human abductions that I've interviewed do not trust, are afraid of, feel that there is a manipulation of them and that they are presented with theater. It can be a theatrical scene of trying to bow down to the human abductee in a craft as if saying, we are sorry that we are doing this, but we must. And eventually, as the 90s and my second book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 1 and then 2, it came out, took 8 years to do those two books. My first one, An Alien Harvest, came out in 89. But in the 2-volume Glimpses of Other Realities, I feel my greatest contribution is that when I had a Series 6, people in the human abduction who were coming to me with illustrations, they were not in any of the same part of the United States. None of them knew each other. I was the only common ground to receive their reports. And it is a large chapter in Volume 2 of Glimpses of Other Realities about what they called the resurrection technology. And suddenly the focus of why would something that was in the alien intelligence category be being kept from us by layers and layers of intelligence and government, but that alien intelligence was clearly interacting with a lot of people on this planet, and that some of them were shown tubes with light in them and full-grown adults, not all human, extraterrestrial, and they all came away with this as their understanding. That container bodies, the non-humans look at bodies as the container bodies of humans, and that what's important are the souls inside. And that to the abductees who had dealt with these non-humans, the soul is the most important part of everything on planet Earth. And how ironic, because in the Western world, the soul has been reduced to something that would be considered almost mythological. Mm-hmm. And yet, it is the abductees who say, in each case, in some variation on this content, it is vital, and they all use that word, comes telepathically. Nobody's talking to them with their lips and sound. Telepathically, it is vital that your entity, which they understood was the soul, remain in the same type of container that you are now. And you are going to die because you had rheumatic fever and your heart is going to give out, and that cannot be allowed. And therefore, we are going to put your soul entity into a new body. And they would see either a body in a tube that they recognized as themselves at the same age or a different age. All of this coming to 2019, when we are now on a planet in which more and more people, even those that have retired from intelligence and military, talk about the importance of understanding the agenda or agendas of a huge variety of other intelligences in this universe, and they are now finally being divided into three categories: friendly, neutral, and unfriendly to the point of hostility. And then there is another layer that Louis Elizondo himself addressed in MUFON in the summer of 2018, when he said that some of the Pentagon funding for investigations of UFOs and an alien presence was denied by forces in the Pentagon because they became convinced that we were dealing with demons from another dimension. All of this has been written in literature for at least the past 70 years. All of this should be honestly reported to every human being alive on this planet Earth to make us stronger, not weaker. All of this, at this point, if we're going to now be putting tax dollar monies into a space force that is actually going to be created to contend with and control those in the unfriendly category. And if that is where we move, Grant, before the world has gotten that major headline, we are not alone in this universe, and here is the evidence why. This planet of power brokers will be doing such a disservice to the human family that it makes me want every single day of my life going forward to keep trying to report the facts and the truth, because my fellow humanity deserves the truth and not manipulation by power brokers that are trying to keep all of us from knowing what they know, that there are all kinds of intelligences in this universe, and that we humans, we were made by them, the different models have been made by them, and essentially Earth is somebody's laboratory.
Okay, so we have about a minute left, maybe a little bit more than a minute. I've got my $64,000 question. You and I have discussed this before. They're probably going to do movies about your life and other people's lives that you lived through. One of the things 25% of all experiences bring up is the idea of reincarnation. You and I have discussed this before. In that light, do you believe that you have made some sort of soul contract to do what you're doing? And are you part of this whole, how do you figure that into this whole scenario?
The simple answer in brevity is yes, and that it would be very interesting to do another show together at some point about what both you and I have remembered about other lives.
Yeah, because that is kind of a critical point, that because your life fell off the edge of the cliff when you saw this cattle mutilation. Mine, when I saw my UFO sighting. John Burroughs, when he had his sighting, his life basically shifted around. Eric Davis talks about his 1991 sighting, where everything sort of shifted and your whole life changes. And so that is an important thing. So maybe let's do another show and let's get into this sort of spiritual implications, because I was going to ask you about, you've had some very bizarre experiences other than the, sort of your straight scientific reporting. And I think people would be interested to hear that you've had, some experiences that sort of are otherworldly and less physical than people would sort of imagine.
My whole life, I have been protected by light, often in the form of a cross. And my new T-shirts say, Linda fights for light, down with entropy, up with light. And that is my mantra.
Beautiful. Thank you, Linda. Let's do another show. Welcome to 2019. And let's hope we get some light this year to reveal to us what is actually going on.
And that headline, we're not alone in this universe and never have been.
Beautiful. Thank you, Linda.
Bye, Grant.
You've been listening to The Cameron Files with Grant Cameron. Any rebroadcast or duplication of this program or program content without express written permission from Grant Cameron himself or the KGRA DB is strictly prohibited. The Cameron Files, in direct cooperation with the internet website BeyondPresidentialUFO.com.